My family's slavery lineage is about to hit national attention. I got in contact with the Block Island Historical Society in Rhode Island and also the Rhode Island Historical Society, and they were quite surprised at what they found with my lineage. I went to ancestry.com and I traced my lineage on my grandmother's side and my mother's side all the way up to Rhode Island and Block Island in the 1700s and the 1600s. I found a German witch who married a black slave, and that black slave is linked to one of the biggest slave-owning families in American history, the Sands family, in northeastern part of the United States. The long and the short of it is that this story is linked to a ghost ship. Slavery, a ghost ship, and witchcraft. Oh my. But in 1738, a ship set sail from England, from Rotterdam. It was known as the Princess Augusta. Princess Augusta was carrying about 300, 400 people, and they were all German immigrants who were heading to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in what was then just a land that would soon be called the United States of America. It had some problems and it stopped in Rhode Island. Had a lot of problems. A lot of people passed away from dehydration, sickness, starvation, you name it. There were two people who were known to be on that boat. One was a short woman, one was a tall woman, but both names was Kate. And the way that they would distinguish them on that boat was one was called tall and one was called short. Now, that being said, the ship allegedly caught fire. There's different stories, but in this one particular story, the ship caught fire, and one of the women who burned up in that fire was the short Kate. They called her a witch, and they said that while she was burning, she placed a curse on Block Island. And to this very day, people claim to see the Princess Augusta on the waters on fire, but they now call it the Palatine. If you look up a book by a woman named Jill Farinelli about the Palatine wreck, in fact, the book is called the Palatine wreck. If you go to chapter 25, chapter 25 speaks about the witch and the slave. In fact, that's the name of the actual chapter of that actual book. I mean, it's called The Witch and the Slave because the witch was tall Kate, the tall one who survived, and the slave was my 8th great grandfather, Newport Sands, who was owned by the Sands family. This woman married a black slave because when you're labeled a witch and you're labeled crazy, you're labeled all kinds of things, and you're poor, your options become limited. So, you know how that goes. The way that we know this for a fact is because she is the grandmother of Violet Sands Hazard. She is a famous black painter out of Rhode Island. Her paintings are featured all over Rhode Island. In fact, there's another guy by the name of Cato Sands. Cato Sands was featured on CBS News, CNN, and his home is still in Rhode Island on Block Island right now. The home that he built. This man was born a slave and ended up being freed. This is why that home is so important. It has a lot of sentimental value because it was owned by a person who was born a slave but passed away a freed man. And that home still stands to this very day. And it's all linked to tall Kate, my 8th great grandmother. And my 8th great aunt is a person who's the other witch who is said to have burned in the Palatine. So the slavery lineage, I found out more about that as well. So I found some wills that was linked to the Sands family, whereas they were speaking about at certain points, they were talking about ending the practice of slavery within the Sands family. Like, for example, Sarah Sands, I found a document. And when I showed it to members of the Block Island Historical Society, they were quite surprised. They hadn't even seen that before. In fact, I got one text from a woman named Janet. She was saying, hey, I've heard of the wills. I've seen some of the wills, but I've never seen it in quite such detail. And she asked me, did I find it on the Wayback Machine? I said, yeah, I use the Wayback Machine to find certain things. I know how to search for things there. Basically, if you read the will, it mentions some of the names of my ancestors, like Mingo Sands, Hercules Sands. I mean, you had Benaja Sands. Benaja Sands is actually my seventh great grandfather and one of the kids of Newport Sands. In fact, his name was Benaja, but it could also be Benjamin Sands. The other thing that I found interesting about this whole thing was that when you continue to read the actual will of Sarah Sands, she said that a lot of the slaves that were being mentioned in that will were to be freed at age 30. So they stopped employing children as slaves. That was also written in the will that no other child will be a slave in the Sands family, and that at a certain age, slaves were to be freed. So Sarah Sands was essentially ending the practice of slavery. And the reason why my lineage and my story is so important is because I just mentioned to you three things that you probably have never heard of in American history that I have direct proof of. One, a white woman willingly marrying a black slave in the 1700s. Two, a white woman freeing a bunch of black slaves when you absolutely didn't have to in one of the largest slave-owning families in American history. I am not absolving Sarah Sands. Sarah Sands was a slave owner. She gets no respect from me. However, that is something that document is something that's very important to American history. And three, the whole thing with the Palatine, the witchcraft thing, and the ghost ship. That's something that is interesting towards American history, and also it fills in some blanks. They didn't understand, like when it comes to the whole witchcraft thing. There's a history of Block Island that I actually found that I presented to the Block Island Historical Society. They were aware of it, but they hadn't read through the parts where it mentioned witchcraft and Kate. So they were saying that Kate back in the day, she did a part-time job of fortune telling. She was already called a witch on the Palatine ship, and that she would have these trances where she would claim to have come back, have visited relatives. That was going on in the 1700s, and I have that in writing. I have direct quotes. So the reason why people found that story so compelling enough to want to feature it on slideshows and feature it for Juneteenth celebrations and potential news articles, and I'm getting like requests for news interviews. The reason why people found that particular story so interesting is that it not only proves the American slave story, it fills in some blanks. It humanizes it, right? Like now, there are people out there who will marry people even though they are certain things. That happened with Kate. But her children were still slaves. They were still listed as enslaved people. So even her having those children and them being biracial didn't save them. She had to buy their freedom. Yeah. So while some people may hear the story and they think, oh, it's a white savior complex, it's not. It was still a horror story. Kate still had to buy her children's freedom. She still had to be enslaved to a black man. She had to be married to an enslaved black man. Had to buy his freedom too. This story involves Cato Sands, who's a man who's born a slave, passed away, but passed away a freed man. The story involves Violet Hazard Sands. It involves black struggle, but it adds more context, and it also fills in blanks where there were a lot of question marks in both the history books, the historical record, and even on the supernatural front. You know, my family speaks about this gift that we have. You know, my grandmother would speak. Everybody has that grandmother that speaks about the gift. And we've been speaking about this for the longest time. None of us knew who Kate was. We didn't know who the Palatine was. We didn't know who Newport Sands was. We didn't know who the Sands family was. We didn't know who Mingo or Hercules or Benjamin Sands. We didn't know who any of these people were. Now we know why we were so interested in all this superstition and witchcraft and stuff, even though we claim to be so Christian. I'm not Christian, but so many people in the family claim to be, but we know something else is underneath. And it's gotten me closer to members of my family in a way that I haven't seen in a while, because I gave some closure, and that alone was worth it.